Okay, so here, let me share my screen. Okay, and everyone can see my screen and hear me and everything. Okay, cool. So, yeah, we're going to talk about React and kind of just it's going to be kind of just a continued introduction today. Last week, I felt like I wasn't fully prepared for my session, and so I do really love React though, and I wanted to kind of get redemption this time. I was just scatterbrained. I had a lot going on. So um, yeah, gonna try to I prepared better for this lesson. So hopefully this is a better, more like formal introduction to React. Um, and as always, if anyone has any questions or wants me to slow down or just clarify things, I'm always happy to yeah, stop, pause, answer questions. I'm here for all of you to help explain things. And so if you're not getting it, just, you know, get up on the mic and yell at me because um, I won't be bothered. I want to help. And so yeah. Okay, so we can just get right started. I'll share this presentation. Um, So this week we're talking about the React DOM and components and kind of just a bunch of other stuff. I kind of decided to just do some like deep dives into things that I feel are important to learn at this stage. And I have an agenda slide here. So this is what we're going to learn today. We're going to do a refresher on just basically what I went over last session. What is the purpose of React? Why do we use it? Um, we're going to talk a little bit about what's going on under the hood. So you've potentially seen these terms show up: Node, NPM, Vite, Babel, etc. Um, and there's kind of just in general a lot going on, a lot of different things that um, you probably haven't gotten like much of a formal introduction to. And so um, I'm not gonna I'm gonna try not to go too deep on this stuff, but I do want to just give a brief overview of how React actually turns into like what you see on your screen. Um, and I think that's just an important thing to know, and it's interesting. And yeah, then we'll talk about the file structure for React projects. Um, so you've probably noticed you have a lot more files in a React project than you're probably used to. Um, what do all those files do? Well, by the end of this, you should have a pretty good idea. At least I'm not going to do a deep dive into each file, um, but I will touch on every single like common part of your React files. Um, I'll then go into the syntax and I'll talk about JSX and just generally React components, how they work. And then some gotchas, which are basically um, things to watch out for. Um, there are common things that trip people up. And so I'll cover a couple of those. And then I'll open the floor to questions. Just a dedicated moment for questions, but that doesn't mean, once again, like I want to reiterate that I am happy to get questions at any point. So feel free to stop me. Um, and then we're going to do some actual coding. And I'm going to be walking through building basically the same app that you're doing for the assignment. I talked to one of the other mentors here, and they said um, it would be nice to not give you all the answers. And so in the past, I've sometimes just uh, basically done the assignment in full. And I want to encourage people to do just a little bit of a step to make sure they understand it. So I'll be building a very similar app to what you need by the end of this assignment. So you're going to have all the concepts, but you're going to need to kind of translate what I do into the actual requirements for this assignment. Yeah. Okay. And I'll stop right away and just ask if anyone has any questions or concerns or anything so far.
I have a little question about TypeScript. Will we use that at least in the future on this course or no?
Yeah, I doubt you'll go into TypeScript in this unit. I don't know if Code the Dream has any courses on TypeScript. They might. I'd say probably not. It's unlikely. I think it's just, yeah. So for those who don't know, TypeScript is like kind of a variation of JavaScript. It's like JavaScript. It's almost JavaScript, but it has some like extra syntax that helps you catch bugs easier, and a bunch of other things. It's convenient. It's a little harder to write when you're learning it and starting, but eventually when you're working on bigger projects, TypeScript can be really useful. I love TypeScript, but I don't think we're going to be going over that. It's just
Gotcha. Thanks. Because
Yep.
I came from like strictly typed languages.
Yep.
And for me, it's a little bit scary to write code without types.
Yep. Yep. Yeah. So TypeScript pretty much any language with types basically gives you some like guardrails to make sure that you don't write code. What happens is your code editor will tell you that the code is wrong before you even need to run it on a program with types. And so it's harder to write, but it at the end of the day makes your code less error prone. Okay, and I got a comment right here. I'm gonna
could I use it like by myself, or it's not supposed to work in this way? So, for example, I just do my homework and use TypeScript, or it will be not okay for the one who will like review that pull request.
I'd say probably stay away from that. You could check in with someone else, like
Yeah, just
maybe ask one of
write
the,
in chat, like in general chat, I believe.
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I
Okay,
would ask.
thanks a lot. Yeah, thanks for answering.
Yeah, because I wouldn't want to, if you are feeling like motivated and inspired to learn, I always think that that's a good idea to, encourage people to pick up things. So yeah, I would ask someone else. Okay, let's get into it. So refresher on last week. Why do we use React? So what problems do React solve? In vanilla JavaScript, updating the DOM is hard. HTML isn't reusable, and large JavaScript projects become very complex and hard to maintain. So those are some of the key problems you'll run into with just regular JavaScript. Why do we use React? Well, React solves at least all those problems I mentioned and more too. You can write less code. Your code is less error prone. It's easier to maintain, and you have reusable components. So for example, like in your HTML, if you wanted to make many different buttons, you actually have to write out all the different buttons. In JavaScript, you can do like a loop. And in React, you can do a loop. So those are just some things that if you are just doing pure HTML and JavaScript, you'll start running into certain errors, or not errors, but difficulties, and React solves a lot of them. So one of the key features of React is having reusable components. So React components can be self-contained pieces of HTML, JavaScript, and CSS. And they're like Lego bricks, ideally. And so a key feature is that like it's JavaScript and HTML together, which means if you want to like, um, take some code from someone else's project, you don't have to go find the JavaScript that's related to it and the HTML that's related to it. It's in the same file. And so it just kind of keeps the same, if you have a lot of, things going on in your app, the HTML and JavaScript for each element will be kind of contained in the same file, which is nice. And I actually have some cool examples. I'll just show you one. This is a component library called MUI. And so they have a bunch of React components that you can download and put into your project if you want. They have tons. You can see all of them over here. It's really cool. It's a great way to kind of build things fast and not have to create everything from scratch. And so this is an example of just one component that I highlighted here, the icon menu component. And you've probably seen something that looks just about like this. And this is not, you can't get something like this in just default HTML. Like there's no single HTML tag that makes this. This is a combination of HTML tags, JavaScript, and even like CSS styles. And you can import this and use it in your project. And it's just like 2 lines of code. It's like one to import the component and then another to put it into your file. And it's almost like using just an HTML element, except it has all this added functionality. And if I click show code, it'll actually show me what this component is made of. Well, it has all these imports, which these are all different components from the same library. So the people that made this library, they have all sorts of different components, and a lot of their components are made up of a series of other components. And so this is the actual React code that makes up this icon menu here. It's made up of a bunch of different components. These are all custom components. And when you use this icon menu in your file, you don't have to write very much. All you have to do is, and I could pull up a blank file really quick here and show you. You would say icon menu, and that's it. So you can get that whole component just by saying that. So that is one of the awesome things about React. Get back to my slides here. So yeah, reusable components, they're great. So a component would generally represent an individual part of your web page. So in this example, I have like a header here, or like a nav bar at the top of the page. And then this isn't, I didn't like actually look at the code for this website, but you could imagine they might have a button component and they can reuse it all throughout their app. And it has a consistent style to it, consistent properties, even like JavaScript interactability. I don't know. That's not a word. Something like that. They have JavaScript and HTML combined into a component together. And so yeah, that a component will generally represent an individual piece of your page. Oh, I see a question. I don't know how to pronounce your name. I'm sorry. Bakari?
Sorry? Yes, I have a
Bakari.
question here.
Yeah.
Once you import the component to your project, can you modify, like for example, for the sign up free, can you change the color if you want and the styling, something like that?
Yeah. Yep. So generally it depends on how the component is made. Like whoever makes the component can decide which kind of things you can change about it when you use it. And that's something that you'll get into in, I mean, maybe next week, maybe the week after, but very soon you'll start learning about how to pass in like arguments. It's almost like a function, how you can pass in arguments to a function. You can do something similar with your components. And so you could maybe say like um, your button, you call your button or you put your button component in your JSX. And then as like it looks like a property on HTML. So you could say like um, button, and then you could say color equals green. Or and this could be a custom component, and your component will have parameters that you specify. So yeah, that's one of the really cool things. And you have to write your component to be able to accept these parameters. And that's beyond the scope of this lesson, but you'll get to that very soon. Good question. Okay, so components are often nested within other components. So you saw that in the example earlier. A component will have this JSX here, and it might have many other components within it. So your app will generally, well, always, your app will be made up of a series of nested components. And it's just like HTML. Like with HTML, you have your root HTML component. And then from there, it's just a series of nested HTML tags. That's how your components will be. And each file will have its own component. So that's, one of the key things that you'll notice is different from JavaScript and React is you have a bit of code in a file, and that's it. It's one small part of your app is in that file. And then all the files are kind of like imported and exported. So they all fit together at the end. Oh, and yeah, that's what this slide is about. Once a component is created, it can be exported, then imported to be used within other components. So here, we could imagine this navbar component that we made, which encapsulates the logo component, the nav links, and the button. And I have another logo right there on accident. But we could imagine we have that navbar. Now we want to put it in like a header component. So we would import navbar from the file that has the navbar component. And then we can now use the navbar in our JSX. And so there's this import syntax and this export default. So these are actually not React things specifically. These are just JavaScript things in general, because it turns out it's really useful to be able to separate your code into different files. And so importing and exporting is key here. And yeah, I think the syntax is pretty intuitive. So I won't do a deep dive into it, but okay, I had a question right here. I have a question, a little confusion with projects that work with JS files and others that work with JSX. Okay, yeah, so sometimes you'll see your components be written in with the file extension JS and sometimes with JSX. So in this project right here, you can see I have, by the way, I'll delete that. This is not valid You need your JSX to be in a component. So that was just for demonstrating. But okay, so we have JSX files here. And then sometimes you'll just see JS files that are the same, like they're still React code, still exporting components. Why is it sometimes your file .js and why is it sometimes .jsx? It doesn't really matter. It is basically both of them work just fine. They're both at the end of the day just JavaScript code. And I think certain like Vite might complain if you just have .js files, but I don't think it does. There's kind of like there's been an evolution of JavaScript or of React over the years. And when I learned React, we actually mostly just use .js in our component files. Yeah, it generally doesn't matter, at least as far as I know. Okay. So we have created a component and we exported it and we can use it in other components. And something to watch out for when you're using a component, even though it is a JavaScript function, all components are just JavaScript functions, but we don't call them like a normal function. So this is how you might imagine calling a normal function. We export our navbar function, and then we want to call our navbar function. This is not the syntax that we would use in React. In the world of React, even though it's a function, we call it like that. So this is the React way of using a component, even though it looks like a function. That's how you use it. Okay. Under the hood. So how does React really actually work? And what are all these words? Node, npm, Vite, babel. Yeah. So as I started writing these slides going into this, I thought I would love to just I'm like passionate about code, and I couldn't help myself but want to explain just a slight tangent on what is code, what like what really is happening on your computer. And so just a slight detour. What is code? Code is text that makes computers do things, which I'm sure you all know by now. How does it really work though? Well, when you write console.log hello world, your computer doesn't know what that means. Computers don't really understand text. So your actual like CPU, which is it's the central processing unit, it's like the kind of core of your computer, and it's what's actually running all the code. It doesn't understand JavaScript or Python or Ruby or any programming languages. What it understands is binary or machine code. That's what it's called. So code that we write needs to be converted into machine code so that your CPU can read it. So we have console log hello world, and at some point, this text right here needs to be translated into a series of ones and zeros that represent the same thing. It's just this translation is what your computer will actually be able to read. Binary, aka machine code. And the process of turning your human readable code, the stuff that we write, JavaScript and stuff, into binary is called compiling. Because we don't want to write binary. It's possible. There are humans out there who can write in binary, but it's not practical. It's a huge pain because it's just hard to make sense of for us humans. And so at the end of the day, the code that we write needs to be translated into machine code. And all programming languages get compiled somehow. If they are going to be run on a computer, they need to be translated into machine code. And so C uses a compiler called GCC or another one called Clang, and I think there's some other ones. Python uses the Python interpreter, which these are all like programs that you can actually download online. So if you want to like write Python code, you have to download the Python interpreter, or I think it comes default on at least Macs. And I think the JavaScript, I think the JVM comes default on most computers too. So yeah, all these different programming languages have their own way of getting turned into machine code. That step is called compiling or interpreted. So like the Python one is an interpreter. There's a subtle difference between compiling and interpreting, but it's basically the same thing. So for JavaScript, the options are the browser or Node. And that's what I'm getting to is that's how all that ties in is Node is what allows JavaScript to be ran by your CPU. So Node translates JavaScript into machine code. And it's a program. You can download Node, and all of you have it so far. If you've been like writing in React, you need Node to make that work. So there's basically two different places that JavaScript can run. One of them is in your web browser. So your web browser can do the translation for you, or Node. So Node is a program that runs JavaScript outside of web browsers. And we can actually see it in action. You can write some JavaScript, and then in your terminal, you can type the command node and then the name of the file you want to run, and Node will run that file as JavaScript. Node Package Manager, NPM. So Node Package Manager is a way to download, it helps you download and use other people's code, which are also called packages in your code. So React is a package. It's a like big giant blob of code out there on the internet, and you can use it. It's code that someone else wrote, and you can use it in your project. There's all sorts of different libraries or packages or frameworks, all different words that mean kind of the same thing, just some code that someone else wrote. And NPM is a way of, well, one thing it can do is download that code for you. So if you type, yeah, I have it right here. If you type npm install React, Node Package Manager will actually go to the internet and install React into your project for you, so that all of a sudden you can start writing React code and you didn't need to go online and download React. Node Package Manager does that for you. So that's the best way I can describe it, is it's taking, it's giving you the ability to use other people's code, and it helps you download other people's code. It helps you make sure that the versions are all correct, because different, all code packages are generally like, they're versioned, which means you have 1.1, 1.2, 1.3. And if you're using the wrong version, you can have conflicts and stuff like that. And so the process of dealing with all those different packages is simplified by NPM. So it allows you to download other other code libraries, and it also helps you run your code if your code is using other libraries. So when you're using other libraries in your code, you need to have npm, or there's other things that are similar to npm that do a similar thing. They're called package managers. And there's pretty much one for like all the languages out there. Like there's one for Python. And yeah, what they do is they help you get other people's code, which from here on out, a lot of the code that you write, probably most of the code you write, is going to be using other people's code, because we don't want to reinvent the wheel. Well, sometimes we do. Depends on, you know, who you are, how much you like doing everything yourself. But yeah, npm helps you use other people's code. And to run your code, if you are using other people's code, you need to use npm to help you run your code. So this is the command you run to run your like React project. Okay, Vite. Vite is what you initially use to install React and create a new React project. And it's kind of new, I think. It at least wasn't, I didn't use it when I was learning React. So it does some things that you can accomplish with other tools, but it kind of like uses those other tools and makes it simple. So what it really does is, and it does kind of a lot of stuff, and I'm not sure exactly what all of the stuff it does, but it bundles your code. So all the imports and exports, it manages those. It helps your code all consolidate into one file. It has a local server, so like live server, something like that. And then it also has Babel built in. And so oh, is my internet working? Can people hear me? I just got a notification that my internet might be unstable.
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. It's good. Well, let me know if I start cutting out or anything, because okay, so for the sake of simplicity, Vite just sets up and manages React stuff for you. Babel. Babel is a compiler for JavaScript, but it doesn't compile your JavaScript into machine code like Node does. It compiles it into different JavaScript. So have some JavaScript, you want to turn it into a different type of JavaScript, use Babel. And there's like a lot going on there that there's like different types of JavaScript, like different versions of it and stuff. But the main thing that we use Babel for in React, and we don't ever have to touch it. This is just what's going on behind the scenes. This is still like under the hood. You don't need to really know this stuff, but Babel enables for JSX. So this hello world in JSX syntax right here is invalid JavaScript. So if you were just using Node to run this, or you had this in your browser, you would get an error. This is not valid JavaScript on its own. And so Babel turns this JSX into this, which it looks really confusing. You don't even have to look at it. Just know that this is valid JavaScript, that for convenience, we can write this. Behind the scenes, Babel is translating it all into valid JavaScript. So I know it's a lot. You don't really need to know these things. You'll start to just get a feel for them as you progress and use more of this stuff. But just know that all of these tools here help support React. They help make React possible. So to zoom back out, before we had JavaScript, Node, and then your CPU. Now we have React, which needs to use Node, Vite, NPM, Babel, all these tools, then it can go to your browser and then your CPU can read it. Okay, I got another question. What does the DOM mean and what's the major purpose of the DOM? So the DOM it stands for Document Object Model. And it's basically it's the representation of your HTML in JavaScript. So in JavaScript, you have objects. And if you want to interact with the HTML, your JavaScript actually has its own version of the HTML in normal JavaScript objects. And so when you want to change your HTML using JavaScript, you interact with the DOM, which is basically JavaScript's like version of all the HTML. It's a representation of your HTML in JavaScript, and React has the same thing. So when you hear DOM, think HTML. But it's not literal HTML, it's a representation of HTML that we can actually interact with in JavaScript. Okay, now to get to the file structure. So in your React app, you have all these files, and it's a lot. What do all of them mean? Well, I'll briefly touch on all of them, and then tell you really you don't need to worry about most of them. So what are all these files? And I made this crazy slide here with all these explanations. And I'm gonna post the slides later in the Slack channel. So you can screenshot this if you want, if you really care. You can also download the slides later. You don't really need to know most of this stuff. There's just a couple things, and I'll make sure to let you know which things to actually take away from this. So I have this key here, which things in the green mean these are things you should be concerned about and be writing code, editing the green parts. Red means you don't need to touch now, and you probably never need to touch. They're just files that are used internally that you don't actually have to worry about at all. And then yellow means eventually you'll be doing stuff with these files, but for right now, you don't really need to understand them or look at them or anything. So in your source directory, that is where all of your actual React code is. So all of your components, your app component, and any other new components you make, those are all going to be in your source directory. And also your CSS. Your node modules folder, that is all of the third-party code. So that's all those packages, all the like libraries and stuff that your code is using. All that other code that you didn't write is stored in here in node modules. And you never need to touch node modules. It's basically like someone else wrote all that code. It's going to sit there in your project and you're not going to worry about it. You can import it and use it in your code. And that's why it's there, because, you know, we're using like React code and React's actual code. If you want to poke around in this node modules folder, you'll find all of the React code in there. The public folder, this is for storing images and other assets, mostly images. For now, you don't need to use it, but if you want to put images in your project, that is one place to put them. You can also put them in like a dedicated assets folder here, which assets, if you're unfamiliar with how that term is used in coding, assets would be like things that aren't code, but like images or video or audio or yeah, anything that's not really code, but it's like supporting files for your project would go in assets. And public is a similar type of deal, except in the public folder, people can actually access those files if they go to your website, whereas in assets, if you don't import it into your project, they won't be able to access it. Package lock.json, don't worry about it. It basically is used by NPM to define all the third-party code and how it all relates. So don't even touch it. Package.json, eventually you'll become very familiar with package.json. It's basically the it's like the central configuration for your project. So you would want to put your project name in there, and any other like details about it. And also it's where you specify which like third-party code you want to use and all sorts of other stuff. So eventually you'll use that. Don't worry about it for now. Vite config.js, that is just stuff for Vite to know how to work and stuff. Don't touch it. Base HTML. So, or yeah, your index.html is basically at the end of the day when you want to ship your React code or your React code just needs to reach the browser at some point, it will end up needing to be included in an HTML file. And this HTML file is, you're not going to write any actual HTML in there. It's basically just it's like almost empty, but it will be populated with all of your JSX eventually. Linting, I'll touch on that later. Your ESLint. Your git ignore file tells Git, don't add certain files into Git. Don't track certain files. So you don't want to track your node modules folder because that's third-party code that you don't want to, you're not going to update, and storing that in Git will just make your project way bigger than it needs to be. Like actual like the size of the files. It's you don't want to include node modules in Git. So git ignore tells Git to ignore those. And then your README, I'm sure you have learned what a README is by now. It's basically your it's where you say, hey, I made this project, and it talks about it. Okay. Okay. So really all you need to know is that the source folder is where you're going to write all your code. All of your components go in the source folder. Okay, that was a lot. Just to kind of regroup, let's pause, take a puppy break, and look at these cute puppies, and I'll answer any questions if anyone has any, and then we can keep going. Is everyone feeling good? Any questions? Okay. We can keep going. So just to kind of reiterate where we're at, we've gone over the refresher, under the hood, React file structure. Now we're getting into the actual kind of meat of it, the React syntax. So we're going to talk about JSX and components. So JSX, as you know by now, it's basically just HTML, but it's in your JavaScript files. So it basically looks exactly like HTML, and it will result in HTML. And it's the React way of kind of creating your whole web page using, instead of HTML, you're using JSX. And there's a couple key differences between normal HTML and JSX. One of the things is you can put JavaScript code, normal JavaScript code, in your JSX. And to do that, you have to escape out of the JSX using curly braces like that. So within those curly braces, you can write normal JavaScript code. So I just have 1+1 in the actual result, like the actual HTML that will get rendered to the page. This expression right here, 1+1, will be calculated, and you'll have a page that has 2 on it. You won't just have 1+1, you'll have the actual result of this JavaScript running, which you can't do that in normal HTML, but in JSX you can. And yeah, that the curly braces are how you escape out of the JSX to write normal JavaScript code. Okay, so building onto that, in JSX, you'll generally want to, well, in a lot of apps, it's common to want to render a list of things. And so to accomplish this, we can map over an array and return some JSX for each element in that array. And I know the syntax looks kind of crazy. If you're all caught up on the homework, you should have something like this in your code already that you did last week. You're using a map. So you're escaping out of your JSX with these outer curly braces, and then you're doing a map over an array. And what the map does is it basically loops over each element in the array and returns something. And so what we're saying is we have an array of things, we're mapping over it, and then we have this arrow function in here. And the syntax can look super weird, but just know it's an arrow function inside this map. And whatever this arrow function returns, you'll end up with an array.
You're starting to break up. Just
Oh, okay. Let me. Okay, I don't know if there's anything I can do about it, sadly, but if it's too bad, then you can stop me. But is it, how is it right now?
better.
Okay, that's good. Okay, so the map syntax can look kind of crazy. And unfortunately, that's just something you have to see over and over and get used to. But I'll show you what it would look like if you didn't use a map. So if you don't use a map and you want to use a for loop, this is how you could do it. You could say, we have an empty array. We want to store that, or we want to store some things in that array. And so we do a loop over things. So we say for let I equals 0, I is less than things dot length, I plus plus. And then for each iteration of this loop, we're going to push something into things things JSX, this new array we're wanting to make. So we're looping over things. And for each of those things, we're going to push some JSX, which is and in this case, we're pushing an LI element into things JSX. So this variable will end up as an array of JSX elements. There's a key when you have multiple JSX elements that are the same element in an array, you have to use key. That's an internal thing. It's how React can actually identify one thing from another thing. Don't worry about it. Just know that you have to do a key when you're doing an array of JSX.
And
Yep.
I have a question on this part.
Mhm.
If the array is not empty, you don't need to push anymore, right? if you already have something in the array?
I'm not sure exactly what you're asking. Could you?
My question is, here the array is here to empty, right? And you
Mhm.
put something inside the array, right?
Yep.
But if the array is not empty, how we handle that?
So we're starting with an empty array. We're imagining things is an array with all of our stuff in it. So things is going to have a bunch of elements, and things, we want this array to end up having all the same stuff as things, except a different version of it. We're going to have a version of it that's JSX instead of whatever was already in things. We are starting with an empty array here because we want it to map one-to-one to things. So for every element, for each index in things JSX, we want it to have a corresponding like same element in things. I know I'm saying things a lot. It's getting confusing, but if this array was not empty to begin with, that's fine too. You can still push onto an on an array that's not empty. This is just the method for filling this array with JSX elements. Does that answer your question?
Can I add one point, please?
Yep.
About pushing inside React components, like if you have like it's a point about having array and pushing so like not an empty one, but having an array with something inside and pushing additional items here inside React component. Usually you need to clone that array to not get in troubles with like when something is changing and
Yeah.
the React component will be re-rendered and it will add that one element that was pushed every time, and it could lead to like super inappropriate and unexpected results. So it's like you need to care about that, like be careful.
Yep. Yep. So just for everyone, what Anton is talking about is a difference between pass by reference and pass by value. So in JavaScript, you can have two variables that actually refer to the same object. And if you're not careful when you're cloning objects, even though they're going to have different variable names, they can end up referring to the same object. So if you modified one object, it could modify the one that's referred to by all those variables. In this case, yeah, it's something to watch out for. In this case, it shouldn't be an issue. But yeah, good point. Okay, trying to get through this. I always go over time, but we're almost to the end, and then I'll start actually coding. So that was JSX, just a little overview of it. Now we're going to talk about components for a minute. So a component is a function in your React project. So each component will be in its own file, and it'll pretty much just be a normal React or a normal JavaScript function. It always has to start with a capital letter. So it's not regular camel case. It's title case, I think is what it's called, where it has to start with a capital letter. And every component, kind of what distinguishes a component in React is that it's a function that returns some JSX. So if you have a function that returns JSX, then that is a component. And another thing to keep in mind is that we're used to writing functions where the return is basically just one value. So the return is on one line. In React, you'll generally have these returns that return like a whole bunch of stuff. And when you do that, you have to wrap it in parentheses. So if you were returning one element here, it could be on one line and you wouldn't have to worry about having these parentheses, but it's just a weird syntax is getting used to. In a React component, your return will sometimes be at the very top of your function, and the return itself will be really big. You know, you might have a return that's like a bunch of different lines, and what that is it's basically saying, I want to return this huge list of JSX elements. And you have to wrap them in parentheses if it spans multiple lines. Just something to watch out for. They are gonna pretty much always, you'll see this syntax, they're gonna be exported. So when you make a new component, you have to say export default. You can leave out default in the case of this project where there's like a slight difference between default and not default, but for this, we're just gonna be doing export default, which means you can have multiple different exports in the same file, but we're just going to say this is the default export. We're not going to worry about exporting any other things in this file. And this is what allows React components to be reused throughout your app, is that you have one component that you specify, and then you export it, and then you can import it and use it in many different files. Okay. Here's some gotchas. So things to watch out for with making JSX and components. So one thing is returning multiple JSX elements like this. So I have on the left side here, I have my component. It's returning a div and another div right next to it. And we're getting an error. And React basically doesn't want you to return multiple elements, but you might think, oh, well, haven't we been seeing these returns that have multiple elements? Well, they have to have one base element. So you can have a series of like nested JSX elements, but at the very root level in your component, there needs to be just one JSX element that all of them are inside of. And so here, we're trying to return 2 at the very base level, and it's complaining. Because in JavaScript, we can't return 2 different things from one function, even if it's JSX. So to solve that, we can wrap the JSX components in another one. So here I go from trying to return 2 at the base level to saying, okay, let's make 1 and then put these 2 inside of it. That works now. That's fine. It's returning 1 element with 2 elements nested inside. Another variation of that, which is pretty convenient, is you can make these what are called fragments, which it's basically an empty HTML tag. And what it says is return these 2 elements inside this parent element, but the parent element is actually fake. It doesn't exist. It's just temporary. So this will not actually result in a component or like an element on your HTML page. This is like an empty HTML tag, and that's a really convenient way of saying, I don't want to clutter up my code with a bunch of, you know, like if you want to return 2 different things and then you have to like nest it in the parent component, that's kind of annoying because you'll end up with all these nested components or nested elements. And so you can have empty, what are called React fragments like that. So that's a really good way of getting around not being able to return multiple elements at the root level. Okay, another common thing you'll run into is you can't use certain normal JavaScript syntax inside of your JSX Like even though we've escaped out of this JSX, so we can write some JavaScript code, certain JavaScript code will not work. We can't write a for loop. So that's why we use map. That version I showed earlier of the for loop, the for loop was actually up here in the component. It was not part of the return. So after the return in your JSX, you cannot write for loops. You cannot write if statements, at least at like the root level of this. If you want, you can make like a function inside of here, like an arrow function. And then in that arrow function, you can have for loops and stuff. But just base level and just in general, you cannot write for loops, if statements, and that kind of stuff. There's certain syntax that's allowed and certain syntax that isn't. And what it has to do with is expressions versus statements. You can write expressions, but you can't write statements. So that's why we'll see using like map instead of a for loop, because you can't do a for loop just in the JSX like that. The map will work. Okay, and I think this is my last thing. One more gotcha. Linting. So it's this weird thing. It's not belly button lint. It's a different type. And I don't know why it's called linting, but that's what it's called. It's this concept of it's a program that's running, that's looking at your code, it's analyzing your code and looking out for things that might just be bad practices. So it'll give you these red squiggles. And normally you've seen these red squiggles as like a syntax error, like your code won't run. In the case of linting, it will give you those red squiggles, those same red squiggles, but it'll just be for like suggestions. And so a common one you'll see is you declare a new variable, and then it'll say, it'll get a red squiggle over it, and it's because you created this variable but never used it. And you can see ESLint, which is one of the files inside your React project structure that specifies all these rules. ESLint has a rule that's saying no unused vars, no unused variables. So it's going to complain at you if you declare a variable that you aren't using. It's not going to break your code. It's just going to like yell at you. And it enforces certain like good like coding practices. And for the case of what we're doing here, it doesn't really matter, but just know that when you see these red squiggles, it might not be that your code is actually wrong. It might just be that you have linting built in this React project. It's a little confusing. I wish the red squiggle was not red, honestly, because it's easy to confuse it with a normal error, but something to watch out for. Okay, questions, and then we'll get into actual code.
I have a question about IDs, like keys IDs of
Yeah.
element inside JSX. I know that it should be like inside because it's like a unique identifier, so obvious reasons. But what if you don't have that identifier and the data came from backend, for example, relying on arrays indexes, it's not a good option because they could be like in different orders from time to time, or like with different keys, so it's not an option, I suppose. So what to do in this situation?
Yeah, good question. You can just use the array index. That's totally fine.
Okay, if the order of that elements will switch somehow.
Yep.
Like it will be unexpected bugs, I suppose.
Yeah, as far as I know, using the array index as the key is generally not a problem. I could be wrong though. If you want, if you're worried about it, you can map over the array and add an ID to each element before you render it, before you put in the
Yeah.
JSX. You
So
could
to
have,
do that explicitly and be sure that like the keys, so the indexes will be exactly the same and like that they are supposed to be. Yeah, it could help. Yeah.
yeah.
So you need a little manipulation, additional manipulation with an array to do that. So
Yeah.
any other options besides that, like receiving a unique identifier from backend, for example, and array usage?
Oh, well, you could just generate a random number as the ID.
So it actually doesn't matter
No.
like the sense of that ID. It just should be there, like
It's used for an individual render cycle in React. It's not gonna really, it's just an internal React thing. It doesn't matter what the value is, it just needs to be unique for each
Mhm.
element in the array. But if it's just 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, that's fine too. React just wants to know that like if you change an element, it wants to like know which part of the DOM it was in.
Yeah.
Which
I
element in the DOM
understand
it was
why
in.
React needs that. I just wondering if we need to rely on that keys somehow, maybe in the future, or yeah, like
I don't
during
think
state
so.
changing.
I'm not an expert, but as far as I know, I've used the index, the array index plenty of times, and it never seems to be an issue. So
Okay, gotcha. Thanks.
good question though.
Thanks.
Okay. How's everyone else feeling?
Pretty good.
Okay. Cool. Well, let's do some coding. Let's start writing some actual JavaScript or React rather. Okay. So I have this project that should look about like how it ended last time. This is the same project that I started last time. I know I kind of like I really breezed through actually writing the code for it because I had a dog that needed my attention last week, but this is about where we left off. I changed to-dos to frogs because I want to not copy the assignment exactly because I don't want people to just copy my code line for line. But just remember, in your case, you're going to have to-dos. In my case, I have frogs. So I'm going to show you how to do basically the work for this week's assignment, but we're working with frogs instead of to-dos. So I assume all of you have a React project that you're already working on from last week. And so I'll just start. I'll continue on from where we were at last week. So remember to start your project. You say npm run dev in your terminal. Node package manager is what's allowing you to do a lot of stuff, and npm run dev is the command you run. That will start your React project. And then we can go to this URL here to see what it looks like. So if I click on that, here we have frogs. And I'll actually open it in a new, I do an incognito window so that my extensions don't run, because browser extensions can sometimes interfere with your code in ways that you don't expect and result in weird errors. So incognito windows fix that. And I'm putting my browser window side by side with my code, so it's easier to see what I'm doing. So we have this base app component here in our source folder, app.jsx. This came default. This is what we modified last week. We have an app component. We declared an array of, in your case, it would be to-dos. In my case, it's frogs. It's an array of objects. Each object has a type. So I have a tree frog, a toad, a bullfrog, and a poison dart frog. And then each has an ID. The ID is needed for the key here, which is just, I mean, I should have added that to the gotchas. But you need, when you're doing a map, you need a key, like as an attribute on this JSX element here. So that's what we have. We are returning in this function, or this app component, we're returning this h1 frogs, which we can see here, and then an unordered list. And then inside this unordered list, we're escaping. And I can show you how to write this from scratch again, if you want to see. This unordered list, we do an escape. So this is how we can write normal JavaScript inside our JSX. And we're going to do frogs, which is our frogs array, dot map. And then map will take in an arrow function. And then that loops through stuff for us automatically. So I'm going to make an arrow function in here. Like that. In the parameter, I'm going to put frog. That can be called whatever you want. This map we're creating a new function here that map will run for each element. And whatever that element, whatever variable we want to store it in, is what we put right here. So I'm going to call that frog. And then here, if I just did frog, that would return a frog for each frog, and this whole thing would end up as the exact same thing. It would be an array of frogs unmodified. But what I actually want to return is, well, for each frog, I want to get some information from that frog and then return a specific JSX element that uses that frog information. So here I'll say we want to return an LI. I'm sorry, I have that window showing up there. So we're going to return a list element for every frog. So this would return just an array of list elements that's the same length as the frogs array, because this map is going to loop through and return a list element for every frog. But we're not using that actual frog data for each of those frog elements in this. And so we can use that by escaping once again inside this JSX, and we can say frog dot type, like that. So returning a list element that has the frog dot type, which, because I have this frogs array up here, each frog object has a type. And so we're saying loop through the frogs. For each frog, return an LI. And in that LI, we're going to put the frog dot type. And then the last thing is we have to do this key thing. It's just for JavaScript to be able to distinguish between different HTML elements that appear next to each other. So we have to have that key, and the key is going to be frog ID. And it automatically, I have Prettier, which is a code formatter, and it automatically put this thing onto a different line. So if I were to go back to how it looked earlier, it'd be like that. And then I can put this on its own line, like that, to make it a little more readable. But then this arrow needs either curly brackets or parentheses after it to tell it what to return. If we do curly brackets, then we need to write return here. If I do parentheses like that, then it's still considered an implicit return. And so I don't need to write the return keyword. Just a subtle thing. Oh, I have a question. Bakari?
Yes, here you print the type. If you wanna print the ID too, how are you gonna proceed?
Yep. For that, I could say frog.type. I mean, right here, I could write normal. Sorry, I have this thing showing up. I could write type. And then we can see type, frog.type, type. So type is being treated as a normal string here in our JSX. And then frog.type is being treated as JavaScript that needs to evaluate. It's not a literal value anymore. It's now an expression that needs to be evaluated. So I could do type, and then I could say ID. And then another escape, frog.id. And I'm sorry about this. Maybe I need to figure out a way to get that window from showing up and cluttering up the screen. So that's how I would get the ID too. And I don't have to put type or ID. I could just put frog type, comma, frog ID, and they need to be escaped like that. And now we have tree frog with its ID, toad with its ID, bullfrog, poison dart frog, all with their IDs next to it.
Thank you.
Yep. But for now, this is all we need. We just need the frog type. So the first step in this assignment is we want to pull this whole frog. In your case, it would be the to-do list. In our case, it's going to be the frog list. We need to pull the frog list into its own component. And so I'll show you how to, because we've been working in this component, the app component that just came default with the app when we did Vite create new React app or whatever. So now we want to make our own, like our first component that we're making from scratch. So I'll show you how to do that here. So we have source, and in our source folder, we're just going to make a new file. And I'm going to call this frog list, or maybe frogs, plural, frogs list.jsx. So we're making a new JSX file with the name that we want this component to end up being. So we want this component to be called frogs list. And so I'm naming the file frogs list. And this whole file is just dedicated to exporting one component.
I'm sorry. I'm very sorry.
Yeah, no
Before
worries.
you doing all those things, you need to create a new branch, right?
Oh, yep. Sorry. I already did that, but I will, I could do,
No, I just want to know because for this week assignment, they didn't tell us to create a new
yeah,
branch.
yep.
I don't know
Yeah.
if it's automatic.
I think they sometimes forget to put that in the instructions. And so yeah, create a new branch. And what you want to do is, make sure that your last branch was you did a git commit and a git push. And then you'll want to do git checkout -b. And I already made this branch, so I'm not going to do it, but you would do lesson_1_2. And I already made that one and did this assignment. And so now I'm on the lesson 1-2 demo just to show, just to recreate all this stuff, just to do it over again. But yeah, you would make a new branch and then you do this work on this new branch. Lesson_1_2. Okay, so we're going to create a new component right here, and I'll zoom in and we can just see bare bones what this component is going to look like. And I might even try, there's this thing called Zen mode in VS Code, and I'll try that out here. There's Zen mode. It gets rid of all the extra stuff. You're left with a very minimal setup, so you can focus on your code. Okay, so this component is going to be a function, because all React components are functions. I'm going to call it whatever I called the file. So frog list. And it's a normal React function or a normal JavaScript function, but it's going to return some JSX, because that's what a component is it's a JavaScript function that returns some JSX. So I'm going to return, and then just for now, let's just do like a div. I'm going to replace that in a minute, but this is a component. This is a component from scratch with all the things that you need from it. The one more thing that you need is you need to export it. And so we're going to say export default before function. Export default function. And now this is a component. This is our own component, and we can actually use this. So how would I put frog? Oh, I called it frogs list. So I need frogs list here. So I'm going to say frogs list. And now I'm going to eventually put our list of frogs in here, like our actual like unordered list and stuff. But for right now, just to get this working, let's try using this component in our actual page, because right now we're not using it. We have this component, but we're not actually rendering it to the page yet. What we need to do is import it into another component and then put this into our JSX somewhere else. So I'm going to go back to our app.jsx. So here we are in our app, which this is like our root component. This is like our base component that just came default. And in this one, let's delete this UL with this frogs list here. And for now, I'm going to import the new component. So I'm going to say import at the top of the file, frogs list. And your like IntelliSense autocomplete might help you out with this. So in this case, it's asking me if I want to import frogs list from this file. And I can click that, and it automatically writes from and then the path to the file. You can write it from scratch, but if your IntelliSense prompts you to import something, it's generally going to help you out. It's going to make it quicker. So that's the syntax for importing this component into this file. And now I want to use it in this component. And so what I'm going to say is we're going to make a new tag here. And we're going to put frogs list in there. So this is now just like in the same way that you've made like a div or, you know, an H1 or whatever. This is our own unique component that we just made. And it looks just like a normal HTML element, except this is our component. So this is like our custom HTML. And here we have an opening and closing tag for it. With your components, you can actually, at least to start, you can make it a self-closing component. This is going to depend on the future, and if you're like passing things into the component, there's a way to do that. But for right now, we can make it a self-closing tag by deleting the dedicated closing tag and putting a slash at the end, a backslash. So that now makes a new frogs list component. And so now I'm expecting, if we look at our, I'll undo full screen. If we look at our page, yep. Okay, so we're seeing frogs list here. So we have frogs, frogs, frogs list, frogs list. So this text right here is actually the text that we put inside this frogs list component. So if I were to change this, we should expect to see the update. So I could do that, and there it is. So we're using this component now. And now we want to render these frogs inside that component. So I'm going to copy this frogs array. I'm going to cut and paste into frogs list. So now this frogs list is going to be dedicated to rendering out a list of frogs. And here we're going to, instead of having a div, we're going to make it an unordered list. And then in here, if you remember, what we want is a map. So we're going to do frogs list or frogs.map. And then for each frog, we are going to return an li. And then we're going to escape inside that li. Because remember, this curly brace syntax is how we escape from the JSX into regular JavaScript. So we're doing one escape for the map. And then the map is returned in JSX. And then in this JSX in the map, we're escaping again. And we're going to get the frog.name. Or wait, frog.type. And remember, in your case, you're going to translate this to working with to-dos instead. So now, one last thing is we add the key, frog.id. And there we go. So this looks the same as how it was before, except now we have a dedicated component for this frogs list. We're importing it into our main app and rendering it. So dedicated frogs list. Next step. Oh, wait, I'll pause. How's everyone feeling? Is this all making sense?
Yep, yep.
Okay. Okay, so that was our first component done. And we could do a git commit. Git add dash, I do dash A, you can do dot, git add dot, git commit dash M, create a, how about dedicated frogs list component. Cool. So that's the first step, and there's one more step. There's only two like kind of big steps in this assignment. So the next step is we want to make a form for adding new frogs, and we're not going to make the form functional yet. That I assume is coming next week, but for now we just want to make a frog form, and I'm gonna just verify with the assignment really quick because I want to make sure that I'm doing it right. So to-do form component. So we add to-do form. We write the JSX to add a new to-do. In my case, it's going to be a frog. So we use a form element. We have a label, an input, and a button, and we import it. And that's it. Okay. Okay, so we're making a second component now. New file, and I'm going to call this frog form.jsx. I think, is that add to do, or wait, add to do form. Okay, I'm going to call this add frog form. Add frog form. That's our new file. And we're going to write our new component here for adding a frog. So we're going to do function add frog form. We're going to export it. Export default function, frog form. And then we're going to do the return. And how about, I like to do this. Let's just, again, let's do, this is kind of like the hello world version for our component. We're basically saying, I made a new component. I want to verify that it's working. I'm just going to make a div that just says add frog form. Let's just make sure that we're able to render this to the page. So we want to put this over here in our app.jsx. So I'm going to say import frog, add frog form. And we're having this autocomplete here. Import add frog form from add frog form.jsx. And above our frogs list, let's make a new thing, add frog form. And again, we can just make this a self-closing tag. And verify, yep. So over here we have add frog form showing up. And I can actually zoom in here. Add frog form. That's coming from this, and then our frogs list is still showing up. So now let's add our actual form into this. So we want this base level component to be a form, which is, that's a default HTML element, or HTML tag is a form. And then inside this form, we want to put an input and some other stuff. Let's put some parentheses around this whole thing, because this is going to end up being multiple lines. And so parentheses allow us to do multiple lines. So it's going to be something like that. And we want an input, a label, and a button. So the input is for typing out your new frog that you want to add. The label is a label for that input, and then the button is to submit. So let's start with an input. Don't have to do type equals text, that's just the default. I think that's good for the input. Okay. Label. Okay, yeah, so the input, we actually want an ID on the input, now that I remember. So the input should have an ID. And the ID can be any string that just identifies it, because when we're doing a label, the label needs to, we need to specify with the label which input it's labeling, because the label is for the input. So the input needs an ID. And let's just say, wait, let's see what they say in the assignment. Input with an ID of to-do title. So let's give this frog title as the ID. And then in the label, you can see I had my autocomplete made this HTML4 attribute here, and you might wonder, what is HTML4? You've never seen that on an HTML tag. Well, what it really is for. So in regular HTML, a label can have a for attribute, which says this is the label for a certain element. And so we'd put frog title there to link this label with this input. But in JSX, for isn't going to work. And that's because for is an actual keyword in JavaScript, and that will confuse everything. You'll get an error if you do this. So instead of saying for, there's a couple, and I should have added this to the gotchas section, but there's a couple properties or like HTML elements. There's a couple things that are slightly different in JSX, and this is one of them. Instead of for, we have to write HTML4 like that. Because in JavaScript, for means I want a for loop. And so that will conflict. And so we replace that with HTML4, does the same thing. And then I could put I guess, add your frog here. Looking not that good, but it's okay. We don't have time for styling right now, so it's just gonna look kind of bad. How about we just put add frog? Add frog. See it showing up there. There's the label, there's the input. Now we need the button. And the button could say submit. Actually, the button should probably say add frog. The label should say enter frog type or something. This is going to be different for you because you're doing to-dos, not frogs, but that's a small detail. Everything else should be about the same. And the type of button is going to be submit. And that's because we're in a form, and with forms, if you put a button inside of it, you want it to be, I think that might happen by default, but I'm used to writing type submit on a button that's in a form. And that's it. That is our completed assignment. If we're in the alternate reality where instead of a to-do list, you're making a frog list. This is your frog list. It doesn't work. If we try to add a new frog, it doesn't work. It's because we haven't added the actual functionality to it yet, but I'm sure that's coming next week. But for now, this is all you need. And basically what you have just kind of been getting used to is creating your own components, exporting and importing them, and just writing JSX in general. And honestly, I think this week is probably easier than last week because last week you had to set up the project, and also you had to make this crazy map, which this time you're just copying and pasting the UL with the map. You don't have to rewrite it. And I'll do a git commit, git add dot, git commit -m, create a form for submitting new frogs. And then I could do a git push. Okay. That's it for the coding. How's everyone feeling about it? Need me to go over anything again or clarify, or how's everyone feeling?
Oh, that was a super helpful walkthrough.
I'm glad.